What if the most systematic military organization of the Nazi regime had been built not by an ideologue steeped in racial doctrine from the beginning, but by a professional soldier who came to the movement late in life, carrying the disciplined ethos of the old Prussian officer corps into something entirely new? What if the architect of one of history's most notorious fighting forces was, by temperament, a man of order and structure rather than fanatical belief? This is the peculiar and troubling paradox at the heart of Paul Hausser's story, a man whose very competence and military professionalism would, in unexpected ways, transform the nature of the Third Reich's armed forces. Paul Hausser was not born into Nazi ideology. He was born into duty itself, and yet, through a series of choices and circumstances that seemed logical at each step, he would become the Obergruppenführer, the supreme group leader, who fundamentally reshaped the Waffen-SS from a small paramilitary organization into a vast military machine that rivaled the Wehrmacht in scale and capability. He would be called, by some, the father of this transformation, by others, the architect of one of history's most efficient instruments of terror. Both descriptions contain a grain of truth, and understanding how one man embodied both requires us to step back and look at not just what he did, but how he understood himself, and how the forces around him interpreted his actions. This is a story about institutional evolution, about the way military tradition can be bent toward unprecedented purposes, and about a figure whose reputation remains contested, celebrated by some as a tactical genius, reviled by others as a knowing facilitator of atrocity. In many ways, Hausser represents a type of historical actor we find difficult to categorize, neither a true believer in the fanatic sense, nor entirely innocent of the machinery he helped construct. If you're drawn to these deeper questions about how institutions transform, how discipline can be weaponized in the service of ideology, and how the choices of individual leaders ripple across decades of history, I invite you to subscribe as we explore together the life and legacy of Paul Hausser, and what his story reveals about the nature of complicity, competence, and catastrophe. For now, let us begin where Hausser himself began, in a world that seemed orderly and comprehensible, in the last years of the 19th century, when the Prussian military tradition still held its grip on the German consciousness, before ideologies would reshape the very meaning of military service itself. Hausser would be born into a family that understood hierarchy, discipline, and the obligations of uniform as natural extensions of social order. These were not small inheritances. They would shape every decision he would later make. Paul Hausser came into the world on October 7, 1880, in Brandenburg, a place steeped in Prussian military heritage. His father, Adolf Hausser, was a major in the Prussian army, a man of position, of rank, of the kind of social standing that came from generations of service to the state. To be born the son of such a man was to be born into expectation. The military was not something one chose, it was something one inherited, the way one inherited a name. From his earliest years, the young Paul would have understood that his life had a predetermined shape to it, that his future lay in barracks and maneuvers, in the study of tactics and logistics, in the perpetual refinement of order and hierarchy. This is important to understand about Hausser because it explains something essential about how he would approach the dramatic transformations of the 20th century. He was, in his bones, a man of the old order, a man who believed in structure, in rank, in the proper functioning of institutions. When that old order began to crumble after the First World War, when the German Empire collapsed and the Weimar Republic emerged as something chaotic and uncertain, Hausser would feel the ground shifting beneath his feet in ways that men like him found deeply unsettling. He had been trained to believe in permanence, in the eternal nature of Prussian authority. Instead, he would watch it dissolve. The military education Hausser received was exactly what one would expect for a boy of his class and background. He studied with rigor and dedication the principles of warfare that had been passed down through generations of Prussian officers. He learned that military service was the highest calling, that duty transcended personal preference, that the individual was always subordinate to the needs of the state. These were not controversial positions in the Prussia of the 1890s. They were simply the basic grammar of how society understood itself. What made Hausser unusual was not that he accepted these principles, most officers of his generation did, but that he would embrace them so completely, so unreservedly, that they would become the lens through which he understood every subsequent event of his life. He was, in other words, a true believer in military order itself, even if he was not initially a believer in Nazism. And so, as we prepare to follow Hausser's journey from this orderly Prussian world into the turbulent chaos of 20th century war and ideology, we begin to glimpse something of the tension that would define his entire life. He was a man committed to institutional structure, entering a period when institutions themselves would be radically reimagined. He was a military professional confronting a regime that would, in time, subordinate military professionalism to ideological certainty. How he navigated that collision, how he rationalized it, how he contributed to it. This is the long and complex story that awaits us in the hours ahead. To understand how a man becomes the architect of an entire military culture, we must first step back into the world that shaped him, a world caught between empires, between the old certainties and the new urgencies of the 20th century. Paul Hausser was born in 1880 in Brandenburg, in the heart of the German heartland, into a time when the German Empire itself was still young, still finding its footing in the continental order. His father was a Prussian officer, as one might expect, and the household he grew up in carried all the weight of that military tradition: discipline, duty, hierarchy, and an almost religious faith in the structure of things. The boy who would one day command tens of thousands learned early that order was not something to be questioned, but to be maintained, inherited, and passed forward. And yet, even as he absorbed these lessons, something else was happening around him. Germany was industrializing with breathtaking speed. The Ruhr Valley was blackening with coal smoke. Railways were stitching the nation together. It was a time of genuine transformation, and into this ferment stepped a young Prussian officer cadet named Paul Hausser. By the turn of the century, he had entered the Imperial German Army, the Reichswehr, and begun what would be a long and entirely conventional military career, the kind of career that thousands of officers pursued through the relative peace of the Edwardian years. But think for a moment about what that meant in practical terms. A Prussian officer in those years was not merely a soldier, he was part of a caste, a way of being in the world. He studied tactics, he learned languages, French and Russian, naturally. He rode horses with precision. He understood himself as a guardian of something larger than himself, bound by an unwritten code that went back centuries. This was the framework into which the young Hausser fitted himself, and he fitted well. He rose steadily through the ranks. He served in various postings. He married. He built a life. And then, in the summer of 1914, everything changed. When the Great War came, and it came with the kind of velocity that made it seem inevitable in retrospect, Hausser was already a captain in the cavalry. He went to the front, first in the east against the Russians, where the vast steppes and the brutal winters and the seemingly endless tide of men from across the empire gave him his first real taste of industrial slaughter on a continental scale. Later he served in the west, in the trenches near Arras, where he saw the British Expeditionary Force and the endless artillery bombardments that turned the landscape into something resembling the surface of another planet. The Great War did something to men, historians tell us. It hollowed them out, or hardened them, or transformed them in ways they could not have anticipated. For Hausser, it confirmed what perhaps he had always suspected, that the traditional methods of warfare, the cavalry charges and the tactical maneuvers that his instructors at the academy had taught him were now obsolete. The old certainties had died in the trenches. A thinking officer, one who could adapt, would need to understand what was replacing them. He survived the war. He was wounded, but not permanently disabled. He saw action, earned decorations, and when the armistice came in 1918, he found himself among those officers who had to confront a peculiar kind of loss. Germany had not been defeated on the battlefield, or so many believed, a myth certainly, but one that shaped the consciousness of the officer corps deeply. Rather, the nation seemed to have simply stopped fighting, stopped trying. There were rumors of revolution, of political betrayal, of stab in the back. And when Hausser looked around at what was emerging from the chaos of 1918 and 1919, he saw a nation that seemed to him fundamentally humiliated, fundamentally diminished. The Treaty of Versailles was signed. Germany was forced to acknowledge guilt for a war that, in the minds of many officers, was not their doing alone. Reparations were imposed, territory was stripped away, and the Reichswehr, that ancient and proud institution, was reduced to 100,000 men, forbidden tanks, forbidden an air force, forbidden the very tools that modern warfare now required. What does a professional soldier do when he is told that his nation must reduce its military to a shadow of what it was? For some, it meant retirement, a retreat into civilian life. For others, it meant finding creative ways to preserve the military spirit, to keep the traditions alive even in reduced circumstances. Hausser belonged to the second group. Through the 1920s, he continued his service in this diminished Reichswehr, but he also did something that was perhaps unusual for an officer of his age and temperament. He began to think deeply, systematically, about military innovation. He studied the lessons of the Great War. He thought about what the future of warfare might look like. He traveled. He learned. He considered the question that was beginning to preoccupy military theorists across Europe and beyond. How would the next war be fought, if there was to be a next war? The answer, increasingly, seemed to involve not the static lines and massive artillery bombardments of the trenches, but something altogether more fluid, more rapid, more dependent on surprise and coordinated movement. The concept was still forming, still being debated, but it would eventually be called blitzkrieg, lightning war. This was the intellectual ferment in which Hausser was moving, even as Germany itself seemed to be stumbling through what would later be called the Weimar period. Years of political instability, economic chaos, inflation that erased savings overnight, and a constant sense among conservative and military circles that something fundamental was unraveling. The question of what would hold Germany together, what would restore its place in the world, was not yet answered. But the answer, from Hausser's perspective, was increasingly clear. It would have to be through military strength, through a rebirth of German power. The old structures had failed. The old certainties had been shattered. What would replace them remained to be seen. The early 1920s saw Hausser navigating a Germany that had already begun to fracture. The Treaty of Versailles had carved deep wounds into the nation's sense of itself, and the Reichswehr, the official, treaty-limited army of the Weimar Republic, existed in a strange, constrained space. It was permitted only 100,000 men. The officer corps, many of them holdovers from the old Imperial German army, found themselves in a peculiar position. They had won on the battlefield, but lost at the negotiating table. What does a professional soldier do when his nation is diminished, when his rank and hierarchy feel suddenly precarious? For Hausser, the answer came through continuity. He remained in the Reichswehr, steadily climbing the chain of command, taking on roles that emphasized organization, discipline, and the cultivation of future officers. His reputation grew quietly. He was not a man of public speeches or political manifestos. Rather, he was known as a meticulous administrator, someone who understood the mechanics of military structure, who could build formations from nothing and instill in them a sense of purpose. These were the skills that would eventually define him, though he could not have known it then. By the late 1920s, Germany's political situation was becoming increasingly volatile. The economic collapse that followed the Wall Street crash of 1929 sent shockwaves through a nation already fragile with resentment. Unemployment soared. The government in Berlin seemed distant and ineffective. Street violence became almost routine, with paramilitary organizations of various ideological stripes battling for territory and adherence. The communists had their formations. The Nazi Party had the Sturmabteilung, the SA. the so-called stormtroopers. Smaller rightist militias proliferated, and throughout it all, the Reichswehr maintained its official neutrality, though many of its officers harbored deep reservations about Weimar democracy itself. Hausser would have observed all of this with the careful eye of a soldier trained to read the political landscape. He would have seen the weakness, the fragmentation, the hunger for order that seemed to grip the German population. He would also have seen something that appealed to a certain kind of military mind, the possibility of reinvention. What if, he might have wondered, a new kind of armed force could be built? Not constrained by treaty limitations, not bound to the old imperial traditions, but something entirely modern and ideologically coherent. By 1930, the Nazi Party's electoral support was surging. Many military officers who had dismissed Hitler as a provincial rabble-rouser began to reconsider. Perhaps this movement, whatever its crude rhetoric, represented the engine through which German power could be restored. The calculus was often simple: support the Nazis, assume they could be controlled, and use their momentum to rebuild German military might. It was a miscalculation that would haunt these officers for decades. Hausser did not leap into the Nazi fold immediately. Instead, he continued his Reichswehr duties, watching, waiting, assessing. But the trajectory was becoming clear to anyone paying attention. The old order was dying. The question was no longer whether Germany would move in a nationalist direction, but how quickly and what form that movement would take. For a military man of Hausser's stripe, rigorous, organized, and ultimately ambitious, the coming transformation would present both opportunity and a terrible moral crossroads that he might not fully comprehend until it was far too late. The path from the constrained world of the Reichswehr to the vast, ideologically driven project of the Nazi state was not a sharp break. It was a series of small decisions, of institutional adjustments, of professional accommodations. Each step seemed reasonable in isolation. Each served a function that could be justified by military logic. Yet the cumulative effect would be to position Hausser at the center of something that grew darker and more sinister with each passing year. In this period of transition, what exactly was Hausser thinking? We cannot know with certainty, as men rarely leave complete records of their private doubts. But we can observe his actions, his choices, his willingness to engage with the emerging system, and from that engagement, a particular kind of responsibility would eventually emerge, one that no amount of post-war recrimination or self-justification could fully erase. The machinery of military bureaucracy has a way of absorbing the individual conscience, transforming it, until what remains is only function and duty. Whether that is an excuse or merely an explanation remains, even now, a question without a clean answer. What we know is that by the early 1930s, Hausser was positioned at a critical juncture. The old Reichswehr was about to be transformed into something far larger, far more ambitious, and far more bound to the ideology of the regime now consolidating power. And Hausser, with his reputation for organization and military competence, would soon find himself drawn into that transformation in ways that would define the remainder of his life. By 1934, Hausser had already begun to distinguish himself within the structures that were reshaping German military life. His appointment came at a moment when the Nazi regime was consolidating its grip on power, and the army itself, the Reichswehr, was undergoing profound transformation. The old officer corps, steeped in Prussian tradition and a certain professional distance from politics, found itself increasingly pressured to accommodate a new ideology. For a man like Hausser, who had spent his entire career in uniform, this transition presented both opportunity and an unspoken moral crossroads, though at the time, such reflections often remained unexamined. The role he accepted was deceptively modest in title, but expansive in implication. He was tasked with helping to shape the future of what would become the SS-Verfügungstruppe, the armed formations loyal directly to Heinrich Himmler and the Nazi Party apparatus, rather than to the traditional Wehrmacht command structure. This distinction mattered profoundly, though many officers rationalized it away. The SS had begun as Hitler's personal bodyguard unit, a paramilitary force, and now it was being militarized. Given discipline, tactical doctrine, structure, someone had to teach these men to fight with the precision and professionalism of real soldiers. Hausser saw himself as that man. What made Hausser valuable to Himmler was precisely what had made him valuable to the Reichswehr before. He possessed what one might call military authenticity. He had faced real combat, understood logistics, knew how men broke under pressure, and how they held together when they shouldn't. He carried the bearing of the old officer corps, not the theatrical posturing of political appointees, but the quiet authority of someone who had genuinely earned his rank. The Nazi leadership recognized that if these SS units were to be taken seriously as military formations, they needed to be taught by men with impeccable credentials. Hausser provided that credential. The years between 1934 and 1936 were quiet ones for him, at least in the historical record. He worked in relative obscurity, developing training programs, writing doctrine, observing the Spanish Civil War from a distance as German and Italian volunteers tested new weapons and tactics there. One might imagine him in offices, reviewing papers, conversing with younger officers, gradually becoming more embedded in SS structures. There is something almost meditative about such work, the slow accumulation of influence, the quiet establishment of precedent. Few dramatic moments are recorded. Yet these were the years in which Hausser was laying the groundwork for what would eventually become one of the most formidable military organizations of the Second World War. The ideological dimension of the SS, however, could never be entirely separated from its military dimension. This is a truth that haunts any examination of Hausser's career, and it is one that historians have long grappled with. The SS was explicitly founded on racial ideology. Himmler's vision was not merely a military one, but an apocalyptic, quasi-mystical one, bound up with notions of Aryan supremacy, genetic purity, and historical destiny. Did Hausser fully embrace this ideology? The historical record suggests a more complex picture. He was, by all accounts, no rabid ideologue. He did not write manifestos celebrating racial theory. He did not give speeches dripping with hatred. Yet he worked within a system built on hatred, and in that work, he became instrumental to its functioning. Here emerges a question that has no easy answer. To what extent can a professional soldier claim separation from the ideological foundations of the state he serves? Hausser would later argue, as many Wehrmacht and SS officers would argue after 1945, that he was primarily a military man, concerned with military efficiency rather than politics. And there is something to this argument. Military professionalism is real. The desire to train men well, to lead them effectively, to minimize unnecessary casualties. These are genuine motivations that existed alongside, and perhaps sometimes in tension with ideological fervor. Yet this argument also contains within it a kind of forgetting, or perhaps a willful incomprehension of one's own choices. By the late 1930s, Hausser's reputation within SS circles had grown substantially. He was increasingly referred to as a stabilizing force, a genuine soldier in a ranks that often contained more political operatives than military professionals. Himmler, despite his eccentricities and his genuine commitment to SS ideology, understood the value of having such men. They lent credibility. They attracted career officers who might otherwise have stayed strictly within the Wehrmacht. They created the impression that the SS was becoming a legitimate military force, rather than merely a terrorist organization in uniform, though of course, it was both. The peculiar genius of the SS, if one can use such a word, lay in this very duality. It could present itself as military institution to the officer corps and to foreign observers, while maintaining its paramilitary and ideological functions elsewhere. Different aspects of the organization spoke to different audiences. For men like Hausser, the presentation was primarily military. For men like Theodor Eicke, who would command the concentration camp system, the function was purely terroristic. The organization was large enough, compartmentalized enough, to contain both, and the separation allowed plausible deniability to flourish, a terrible convenience for conscience. Hausser's family life during these years remains largely absent from historical sources. This absence itself is telling. We know little of what he thought about in the privacy of his home, how he explained his work to his wife, whether doubts ever surfaced in quiet moments. The historical record tends to preserve what is official, what is public, what is recorded. The interior landscape of ordinary men making their peace with extraordinary circumstances tends to vanish, leaving only the shell of decision and action behind. We are left to imagine the silences, the conversations never written down, the small moral accommodations that accumulate over time until they become indistinguishable from conviction. It was during this same period that Hausser began to develop the training methods that would define his legacy. He insisted on rigorous physical conditioning, on marksmanship, on tactics drawn from real warfare. He believed in discipline, but not merely the arbitrary discipline of parade grounds. He wanted soldiers who understood why they were being trained, who possessed initiative within a framework of orders. This approach, sound from a purely military standpoint, would eventually create formations that were genuinely dangerous, not merely as ideological vessels, but as fighting units. And in creating soldiers, he was creating instruments of a terrible power. By the early 1930s, as Hitler consolidated power and began remaking German society in the image of his vision, the landscape of military possibility had fundamentally shifted. The old Reichswehr, that carefully balanced force that had maintained itself through the chaos of the Weimar years, found itself increasingly pressured to expand, to absorb new ideologies, and to make room for parallel power structures that the Nazi regime seemed intent on creating. It was into this atmosphere of transformation and tension that Paul Hausser, now in his middle 50s, made a choice that would define the remainder of his career and leave a permanent mark on 20th century history. By 1934, Hausser had been quietly working within the regular army for some years, but his position was becoming uncomfortable in ways that were difficult to articulate but impossible to ignore. The Nazi Party had already begun to shadow the traditional military hierarchy with its own formations, its own armed units, its own loyal structures that answered to different authorities and followed different philosophies. The Schutzstaffel, the SS, had grown from a small party bodyguard force into something far more ambitious and far more dangerous. It was becoming a state within the state, and it represented something that many old-school officers like Hausser found philosophically troubling, even as others found it politically pragmatic. What made Hausser's decision so significant was that it was never simply a passive acceptance of circumstance. Rather, he made an active choice to move into the SS officer corps, to transfer his considerable military expertise into an organization that was, by most traditional definitions of military honor and constitutional propriety, a criminal enterprise from its very inception. The question of why he made this choice, what internal calculations, what compromises with his own conscience, what genuine belief in aspects of what the regime was attempting, remains one of the more difficult and morally complicated questions surrounding his biography. Was it careerism? Was it a genuine belief that the SS could be reformed into something more militarily respectable? Was it a desire to impose some restraint on an organization that seemed destined to become ever more radical and violent? The answer likely contained elements of all three, though historians have debated the emphasis for decades. What we can say with certainty is that Hausser brought to the SS a kind of military professionalism that the organization had previously lacked. He arrived with the bearing of a career officer, with decades of combat experience, with a deep knowledge of military theory and practice that came from the old Imperial tradition and the thoughtful years of the Weimar period. In some sense, he represented an attempt by elements within the SS to become something more than just a party militia, to transform themselves into a genuine military force that could command respect even within traditional military circles. His early work within the SS structure involved organizing and training new units, establishing standards, developing doctrine for how armed SS men should conduct themselves in the field. This was work that played to his genuine strengths. He was a teacher and an organizer, someone who understood that effective military formations required not just enthusiasm or ideological commitment, but discipline, training, clear hierarchies, and a shared understanding of proper conduct under arms. In this sense, his presence in the SS represented a kind of institutionalization, the transformation of something chaotic and revolutionary into something more stable and structured, at least on the surface. Yet this very institutionalization carried with it its own dark implications. By lending his prestige, his experience, his professional standing to the SS, Hausser was in effect helping to legitimize an organization that was already committing atrocities, that was already participating in systematic violence against prisoners, against political opponents, against Jews and other groups the regime had targeted for persecution. A more skeptical observer might ask whether his efforts to make the SS more professionally military were genuinely intended to restrain its violence, or whether they were in fact helping to make that violence more effective, more systematic, more difficult to resist or escape. The answer to that question depends partly on when one dates the beginning of Hausser's service, and partly on how one interprets his stated intentions versus his actual effects. What seems clear is that as the 1930s progressed and the regime became more openly radical, more willing to commit to its most extreme ideological programs, Hausser found himself increasingly embedded within a system that was accelerating toward catastrophe. He had made choices that, whatever their initial justification or intention, had the cumulative effect of tying his fate and his legacy to one of history's darkest enterprises. The formation of the SS-Verfügungstruppe marked a turning point, not merely in Hausser's career, but in the very nature of what armed force could become under ideological direction. By the mid-1930s, the organization was growing beyond its original paramilitary function, expanding into something more ambitious, more dangerous, and in Hausser's view, more necessary. The boundaries between police work and soldiering were becoming deliberately blurred, and within this ambiguous space, Hausser found his purpose crystallizing. What drove a man of his military bearing, his Prussian discipline, to invest so deeply in building an organization so explicitly bound to Nazi ideology? Perhaps it was not a sudden conversion but a gradual surrender to logic. Hausser believed that the future of Germany required a new kind of soldier, one who understood that military duty and political commitment were inseparable. The old army, he had come to think, was too detached, too removed from the historical moment in which it operated. The SS-Verfügungstruppe would be different. It would be conscious, ideologically awake, and Hausser would be its chief architect of military competence. Between 1934 and 1939, he established training standards that were, by any objective measure, rigorous and modern. Hausser implemented advanced small unit tactics, emphasizing speed, deception, and aggressive movement. He borrowed from the lessons of the First World War, but applied them with a ruthlessness suited to what he believed would be a new age of warfare. His recruits trained in mountainous terrain, in simulated urban combat, under conditions of sleep deprivation and stress, designed to separate those with genuine military aptitude from those merely seeking rank and insignia. The relationship between Hausser and Heinrich Himmler, the Reichsführer SS, was one of curious interdependence. Himmler possessed the political authority and the ideological certainty. Hausser possessed the military knowledge and the capacity to translate ideology into effective fighting force. Himmler wanted an army that answered to him alone, free from the Wehrmacht's influence and traditions. Hausser wanted resources, autonomy, and the legitimacy that came from Himmler's patronage. Each man needed the other, though perhaps neither fully trusted him. By 1937, the SS-Verfügungstruppe had grown to approximately 8,000 men, divided among several divisions. They were beginning to be visible on the streets of German cities, their black uniforms and insignia immediately recognizable, immediately feared by some, admired by others. Hausser moved among them with the bearing of a general, though his rank remained technically subordinate to Himmler's. He held the title Oberführer, a rank that sat awkwardly between senior officer and mid-level commander, but it carried in its ambiguity a kind of power. Hausser was answerable to Himmler in structure, but independent in practice, a man whose authority derived not from formal hierarchy, but from his evident competence and his ability to deliver results. The Austrian Anschluss of March 1938 provided the first major public display of the SS-Verfügungstruppe's capabilities. Hausser's men crossed the border into Austria as part of the occupation force, and their performance was noted. They moved with precision, they were disciplined, they followed orders. To the Nazi leadership, they demonstrated that this force could function as an army, not merely as internal security apparatus. To Hausser, the Anschluss was validation. He had built something that worked. Yet within him, if we might reflect on the interior landscape of such a man, there must have been questions that arose in the quiet hours before sleep, questions about what he was building, about the purposes to which this force would ultimately be directed. Did he imagine war on the scale that would come? Did he understand that the army he was so methodically training would soon be tasked not with external conquest alone, but with something darker still, tasks that would require not merely military skill, but a willingness to see human beings as categories, as problems to be solved through methods that transcended traditional warfare? The Munich Agreement of September 1938 and the subsequent Czech occupation in March 1939 offered further opportunities for the SS-Verfügungstruppe to demonstrate its readiness. With each operation, Hausser's reputation grew. With each deployment, the force became more experienced, more confident, more integrated into the machinery of German military power. The Wehrmacht's leadership watched with a mixture of respect and wariness. Here was an organization that operated by different rules, answered to a different authority, pursued objectives that sometimes diverged from traditional military strategy. As 1939 opened, the final months before the outbreak of European war, Hausser was positioned at the apex of an extraordinary transformation. What had begun as a personal bodyguard unit, a paramilitary force of party loyalists, was becoming something capable of projecting military power across borders. And Hausser, the former Reichswehr officer who had once seemed like an anachronism in the new Germany, had become indispensable to that transformation, a bridge between the old army's traditions of competence and the new regime's demands for ideological purity. By the time Hausser had consolidated his vision within the military framework, the question that began to occupy his mind was no longer whether the SS could become a disciplined fighting force. It was how far that force could be expanded without losing the ideological core that had always defined it. The Waffen-SS, by the early 1940s, had grown well beyond those initial regiments of ideological believers and racial zealots. Men were joining for different reasons now. Some came because they believed in the cause, others came because they saw opportunity within the ranks. Still others came because service in the Waffen-SS offered escape from the grinding monotony of civilian life, or because conscription into regular Wehrmacht units seemed less promising than voluntary service in a formation that was gaining reputation for ferocity and tactical innovation. Hausser recognized this transformation taking place, and it troubled him in ways that were difficult to articulate even to his closest colleagues. The purity of purpose that had animated the earliest SS units, that sense of fighting for something beyond merely military victory, was becoming diluted by necessity and scale. When you recruit thousands of men, when you expand from regiments to divisions to corps, when you must staff them with officers and non-commissioned officers, drawn from an ever-widening pool of talent and background, something invariably shifts. The question becomes less about who believes most deeply and more about who can be trained most effectively. And yet, Hausser adapted to this reality with a kind of pragmatism that may surprise those who view him only through the lens of ideology. He understood, perhaps better than many of his peers in both the SS and the Wehrmacht, that wars are not won by belief alone, They are won by supply lines and logistics, by firepower and maneuver, by the ability to coordinate thousands of men across vast distances under conditions of extreme stress. If the Waffen-SS was to survive as a military organization, and more crucially, if it was to prove itself worthy of the resources the Reich continued to pour into it, then it had to perform at the highest levels of military competence. This created a peculiar kind of tension in Hausser's leadership philosophy, one that would define much of his work through the middle years of the war. On one hand, he remained committed to maintaining SS ideological education, to ensuring that officers and men understood themselves as part of something larger than a conventional army unit. On the other hand, he became increasingly focused on the mechanics of military excellence, on training methods that could produce soldiers capable of executing complex tactical operations with precision and confidence. The tactical innovations that emerged from Waffen-SS formations during this period reflected this dual emphasis. Hausser championed new approaches to combined arms warfare that integrated infantry, armor, and artillery in ways that diverged from some of the more conventional wisdom in the Wehrmacht. He believed in aggressive reconnaissance, in the maintenance of momentum in attack, in the willingness to accept tactical risks in pursuit of operational objectives. These were not innovations born purely from ideology, though ideology certainly informed the aggressive spirit in which they were pursued. They emerged instead from careful study, from observation of how other militaries conducted operations, from a genuine interest in military craft as a discipline. What made Hausser different from some other senior SS commanders was his willingness to engage with technical military questions on their own terms, without constantly filtering them through an ideological lens. This does not mean he abandoned his commitment to National Socialism or to the SS as a political organization. Rather, it means that in his role as a military commander, he tried to separate the question of how to fight effectively from the question of what one was fighting for. For many of his contemporaries in the SS officer corps, such a separation would have seemed not only impossible, but potentially disloyal. For Hausser, it was a necessary discipline. Consider the evolution of SS training methods during the early 1940s. Hausser instituted regimens that were physically demanding and psychologically rigorous, designed to push recruits beyond their perceived limits and to create a bond of shared hardship among the men. But he also incorporated classroom instruction in tactics, in military history, in the technical aspects of weaponry and equipment. He believed that an educated soldier, a soldier who understood not just the what and the how, but also the why of military operations, would be a more effective soldier. This educational emphasis was unusual enough in the Wehrmacht, let alone in the SS, where ideology had traditionally trumped technical expertise. The relationships Hausser built with senior Wehrmacht commanders during this period reveal something important about how he maneuvered within the larger military hierarchy. While SS commander Heinrich Himmler remained his nominal superior and the source of his ultimate authority, Hausser cultivated working relationships with Wehrmacht generals who respected military competence and results. He attended conferences where operational plans were discussed, offered critiques and suggestions, and made it clear that the Waffen-SS was not simply a political organization playing at soldiering, but a genuine military force worthy of serious consideration in the planning of major operations. This positioning, between the political demands of the SS hierarchy and the professional military culture of the Wehrmacht, required constant navigation and careful word choice. Hausser had to be careful never to appear as though he was distancing himself from Nazi ideology or from his loyalty to Himmler. At the same time, he needed to be credible with Wehrmacht officers who, while loyal to the regime, sometimes viewed the SS with skepticism or even disdain. The balancing act was delicate, and it required the kind of political acumen that goes largely unnoticed by history because it does not produce dramatic moments or memorable speeches. It operates instead in the quiet spaces between institutions, in the careful cultivation of personal relationships and professional reputation. By the time Hausser had fully taken command of the SS Verfügungstruppe, in the late 1930s, Europe itself had begun to shift beneath the foundations of the old continental order. The military he inherited was still small, still searching for its identity, still regarded by many in the Wehrmacht as something altogether separate, a party police force, not a genuine army. And yet Hausser could see, with remarkable clarity, what others only glimpsed in fragments. He understood that whoever controlled the narrative of modern soldiering would shape the century. And so he set about building not merely units, but a mythology, not through propaganda alone, though that certainly flowed through every rank and file, but through something more fundamental, the creation of a military culture that felt, to those who belonged to it, like membership in something transcendent. The training methods Hausser introduced were, by the standards of his era, genuinely innovative. He believed that the modern soldier required not blind obedience, but rather a kind of thinking obedience, discipline married to initiative, structure married to adaptation. Where the traditional Prussian army had valued the unthinking execution of orders from above, Hausser pushed instead for unit leaders who could interpret intentions and respond creatively to circumstances. This philosophy, filtered through the ideological framework of National Socialism, became something rather different in practice than perhaps it might have in another context. And yet the core pedagogical insight remained sound. Soldiers fight better when they understand not just what to do, but why they are doing it, and when they possess the autonomy to solve tactical problems in their immediate environment. Consider for a moment the historical paradox that was unfolding. Here was a man trained in the classical Prussian military tradition, shaped by the hierarchical certainties of the Imperial General Staff, now building an organization that blended rigid ideological conformity with tactical flexibility. The contradiction ran deep, and yet somehow the synthesis worked. Men who trained under Hausser's system developed a reputation, well earned it should be noted, for competence and tactical acuity. They could coordinate complex movements across difficult terrain. They could shift from one form of combat to another with fluidity. And they did so because they had been taught to think of themselves not as cogs in a machine, but as conscious participants in a historical mission, however dark that mission would become. The role of ceremony and symbol in Hausser's SS cannot be understated when one attempts to understand how he held such enormous influence over young men. The midnight torchlit marches, the rune insignias, the elaborate oath-taking rituals, all of these served a psychological purpose that extended far beyond mere pageantry. They created what anthropologists and psychologists have come to recognize as a kind of liminal space, a threshold between the ordinary civilian world and something transcendent and terrible. Once a young man stepped across that threshold, once he had sworn his sacred oath in the darkness beneath the symbols, something shifted in his understanding of himself. He was no longer merely a soldier, he was a guardian of something sacred, or so he had been told to believe. The ordinary rules of civilian morality, carefully and deliberately, were repositioned as applying to his comrades and superiors, but not necessarily to those designated as outside the community. This is perhaps the most important and most troubling aspect of Hausser's legacy, and it must be named clearly. He did not simply build an effective military organization. He built a system of meaning-making that allowed educated, intelligent men to participate in atrocities while maintaining a sense of moral purpose. The SS under his direction became not merely a military force, but a kind of totalistic community, complete with its own ethics, its own law, its own understanding of right and wrong. And this community, this closed moral universe, bore within it the capacity for extraordinary evil precisely because it had been given the conceptual tools to redefine good and evil according to its own internal logic. Yet there remained, even in Hausser himself, echoes of an older military code. He maintained a distance, at least to some degree, from the most extreme ideological pronouncements. He did not, unlike many of his contemporaries and subordinates, become a racial fanatic in the manner of those who spent their entire consciousness marinating in Nazi doctrine. He was, one might say, a man who used the ideology as a tool and a framework, rather than a man who was consumed by it. Whether this distinction makes his role less culpable or merely adds a layer of complexity to an already tangled moral question remains contested by historians even now, decades after his death. The question that emerges from this period of Hausser's career is one that historians still turn over in their minds with discomfort. How is it that organizational excellence and systematic evil can inhabit the same institution? How can a man who was, by many accounts, a capable and conscientious officer, also be responsible for building the organizational structure within which thousands of men committed murder on an industrial scale? The answer is not simple. It involves the compartmentalization of conscience, the gradual normalization of abnormality, the way in which institutional logic can override individual moral judgment. It involves, too, a particular historical moment in which the normal guardrails of civil society had been dismantled, in which the state had claimed monopoly not merely over violence, but over the very definition of morality itself. The paradox that would define Hausser's entire career had already begun to crystallize by the mid-1930s. Here was a man who had served the old Imperial army with distinction, who understood military discipline and hierarchy in ways that belonged to an entirely different epoch, now finding himself drawn into the orbit of something far more radical and all-consuming than anything the Kaiser's Germany had ever attempted. The Nazi Party wasn't simply a political movement seeking power through conventional means. It was, in many ways, a revolutionary force that demanded not just loyalty, but ideological purity, a complete reorganization of society around principles that had little to do with traditional military professionalism. And yet Hausser, this aging Reichswehr officer whose entire adult life had been devoted to the old ways, began to see in the SS something that might bridge that impossible gulf. The SS itself was transforming during these years. What had begun as a small paramilitary bodyguard unit under Heinrich Himmler's leadership was expanding into something far more ambitious and sinister, though the full scope of its future intentions remained obscured even from many within its own ranks. Himmler, a man of obsessive organization and pseudo-scientific racial theories, was building what he envisioned as a racial elite, a core of men selected not merely for their fighting ability, but for their supposed biological and ideological superiority. It was a vision that would have appalled traditional military men just years before. Yet Hausser found something in this framework that called to him, or perhaps he simply recognized the direction history was moving and chose to adapt rather than resist. The question that haunts any examination of Hausser's decision to formally join the SS in 1934 is deceptively simple on the surface, yet impossibly complex when truly examined. What did he believe he was joining? A man of his generation and education would have understood the racial ideology flowing through Nazi theory. He would have been aware of it in broad strokes at minimum. Yet there exists a difference between intellectual awareness of a dangerous ideology and comprehension of where that ideology leads when given absolute power and unlimited resources. Hausser's papers and later recollections suggest he was drawn primarily to the possibility of building a modern, efficient military force, unfettered by the constraints of traditional military bureaucracy. He saw an opportunity to create something entirely new, a fighting force that could be molded from its inception according to principles he believed were superior. The military technician in him, the man who had spent decades within rigid hierarchies and conventional structures, glimpsed the possibility of genuine innovation. But innovation toward what end? This question haunted military historians and prosecutors for decades after the war. Hausser himself would later claim, with varying degrees of conviction depending on the forum, that his primary concern was military excellence and modernization, that the ideological dimensions were secondary or even incidental to his purposes. Yet the SS was never merely a military organization in any conventional sense. From its earliest days, it was explicitly bound to Nazi racial ideology. Every man who joined understood, at minimum, that he was entering an organization dedicated to the proposition that German racial superiority was scientifically proven and morally justified. The oath that SS recruits took wasn't simply to obey their commanders, or even to serve the state. It was to serve the Führer personally, to place absolute obedience above all other considerations, and implicitly to accept the ideological framework that justified everything the Nazi state would do. Hausser's entry into the SS therefore represented not a minor career move, but a fundamental choice about which future he would embrace. The Reichswehr, for all its faults and all the ways it had already compromised with the Nazi regime, still retained something of the older military tradition, a professional code that existed somewhat apart from politics. The SS, by contrast, was politics in its purest and most violent form. It was the instrument through which ideology became action. To join it was to become, whether one fully comprehended the implications or not, a tool of something unprecedented in human history. The timing of Hausser's entry into the SS is itself instructive. He was 50 years old, an age when most men settle into comfortable positions of established authority and reputation. He had reached a respectable rank within the Reichswehr, a position from which he might have continued until retirement without particular difficulty. The Reichswehr during the early 1930s was attempting, within careful limits, to expand and modernize itself, in violation of the Treaty of Versailles. There were opportunities for an officer of Hausser's abilities within this expanding conventional military. He chose instead the more uncertain path of the SS, an organization that existed, technically, entirely outside the legal military establishment, a parallel institution growing in the shadows of official power. What this choice meant in practical terms was that Hausser was positioning himself to participate in the creation of something genuinely new. The SS was building an organization from near nothing, creating structures and doctrines and hierarchies without the accumulated weight of centuries of tradition. For a military man of innovation and ambition, this represented an extraordinary opportunity. For a man of conscience, it represented an abyss. History suggests that Hausser was primarily the former, though the question of whether he understood the full moral dimensions of what he was choosing remains genuinely open. Perhaps, in the way that humans often do, he saw what he wished to see and rationalized away the rest. Perhaps he believed that participation would allow him to moderate the worst impulses of the organization. Perhaps, and this possibility darkens considerably, he agreed with more of the ideology than he later admitted. The truth, as is often the case with the crucial moral choices of history, likely contains elements of all these possibilities in proportions we can never fully determine. What is clear is that by joining the SS in the mid-1930s, Hausser was beginning a transformation that would ultimately define him entirely. He was no longer merely a Reichswehr officer dabbling in Nazi politics. He was becoming a founding figure in the organization that would serve as the military wing of Nazi ideology itself, the instrument through which some of the greatest horrors of the 20th century would be committed. And yet in those early days, as he took on his first assignments and began to develop his ideas about how the SS ought to be structured militarily, he was still, perhaps, a man who might have walked away. That opportunity, if it ever truly existed, would not last long. By the autumn of 1940, the vision that Hausser had cultivated within the officer corps of the Waffen-SS was beginning to take on a tangible military form. The recruits arriving at training depots across occupied Europe were no longer merely ideological volunteers drawn by Nazi propaganda, but rather a growing stream of conscripts and volunteers who would be shaped through a disciplinary apparatus that Hausser himself had helped to architect. And here we arrive at a peculiar tension in the historical record, one that historians have long grappled with in their attempts to understand what made the Waffen-SS simultaneously an elite fighting force and an instrument of the regime's darkest impulses. Hausser's personal contribution to the training methods and doctrinal foundations of these units remains difficult to disentangle from the broader institutional machinery that surrounded him. The reality was that by this point, Hausser held considerable influence over how new soldiers would be inducted into what was increasingly becoming a professional military organization, distinct in theory if not always in practice, from the racial zealotry of the Nazi Party itself. His emphasis on rigorous training standards, on fieldcraft and tactical proficiency, on the building of unit cohesion through shared hardship, these were genuine military virtues, the kind that any competent commander would emphasize. Yet they existed within a framework that was fundamentally corrupted by ideology, by the knowledge of what the regime was beginning to do across the territories it controlled. How much of this corruption reached into the daily consciousness of officers like Hausser, or remained compartmentalized in the minds of those who preferred not to look too closely at the machinery around them? That remains one of the central mysteries of his later testimony and his carefully constructed memoir. Throughout 1940 and into 1941, the Waffen-SS expanded rapidly. Hausser oversaw the creation of training protocols that would remain in place, with modifications, for years to come. The SS Verfügungstruppe divisions, the two existing formations, the 1st and 2nd, were now being joined by new units drawn from ethnic Germans living in conquered territories, volunteers from occupied Scandinavia, and an array of ideological enthusiasts who had enlisted in the service of what they believed was a greater Germanic cause. The organizational structure that Hausser had imagined was finally coming into being on a significant scale, and the results were evident to anyone observing Wehrmacht operations in the East. These soldiers trained under Hausser's influence proved remarkably effective in combat, tactically sound in their employment, and possessed of a cohesion and esprit de corps that was genuinely impressive from a purely military standpoint. But let us pause for a moment on this observation, because it raises an uncomfortable question that historians have wrestled with for decades. What do we do with military competence in the service of an evil cause? The Waffen-SS, by the early 1940s, was becoming known for its aggression in combat, its willingness to engage in actions that conventional Wehrmacht units sometimes balked at, and its cultivation of a warrior ethos that bordered on the fanatical. Hausser was not ignorant of these developments. Indeed, he had contributed to them through his emphasis on martial values and unquestioning discipline. And yet, in his later recollections, he would often frame his own role as that of a professional military man, somewhat insulated from the political dimensions of the organization he served. Was this accurate? Was it a form of self-deception? Or was it a calculated narrative constructed for a post-war audience that needed to sort the innocent from the guilty? The distinction Hausser often drew between his own military duties and the ideological mission of the SS organization as a whole became increasingly difficult to maintain as the war progressed, and the nature of that ideological mission became ever clearer. In 1941, as the Wehrmacht launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, the role of the Waffen-SS would shift fundamentally. These were no longer merely elite formations serving as shock troops for territorial conquest, though they certainly remained that. They were becoming something far more sinister. They were becoming instruments of genocide, units that would operate in close proximity to the Einsatzgruppen death squads, that would participate in or facilitate massacres, that would bear direct responsibility for atrocities that would later be meticulously documented and prosecuted at Nuremberg. Hausser's personal role in directing these developments remains contested among scholars. Some suggest that he maintained sufficient insulation from the worst excesses, that his focus remained primarily on training and tactical matters rather than on the operational employment of his units in rear-area atrocities. Others argue that this distinction is impossible to maintain, that a commanding officer cannot simply claim ignorance of what his subordinates are doing, particularly when those subordinates are operating under general directives that come from the highest levels of the organization. The truth, as is often the case with historical questions of culpability and knowledge, likely lies in a gray zone that defies easy moral or legal categorization. What we can say with certainty is that by 1941, Hausser had become one of the most influential figures in the Waffen-SS hierarchy. His organizational reforms were bearing fruit. The training system he had devised was producing soldiers who were operationally proficient and ideologically committed. The officer corps that had been shaped under his mentorship was beginning to occupy positions of greater responsibility. and the institution itself was expanding at a remarkable pace, absorbing new personnel and new ideas, while maintaining a continuity of doctrine and philosophy that Hausser himself had helped to establish. In many respects, he was witnessing the realization of his vision, an elite military formation built on meritocratic principles, selective recruitment, rigorous training, and an intense esprit de corps. That this vision was being realized in the service of a regime engaged in unprecedented crimes against humanity is a fact that Hausser's later defenders often seem reluctant to fully grapple with. The expansion of the Waffen-SS during this period also brought with it new complexities in terms of recruitment and ideological commitment. Where the original SS had been composed of carefully selected volunteers, many motivated by genuine ideological fervor, the new entrants to the rapidly expanding formations included conscripts, men from occupied territories who were compelled or pressured into service, and others who joined primarily for economic opportunity or simple lack of viable alternatives. Hausser's training apparatus was designed to absorb this heterogeneous mass and forge it into a coherent military force. Whether this represented an evolution toward a more professionally military organization or a dilution of ideological purity was a matter of considerable debate within SS leadership circles at the time. Hausser himself seems to have viewed it as an inevitable and even desirable development, evidence that the Waffen-SS was becoming a true military organization rather than a mere paramilitary militia. This perspective would serve him well in his post-war defense, allowing him to argue that he had been moving the organization in a more professional and less ideologically extreme direction. Whether this narrative reflects the historical reality or represents a form of retrospective self-justification remains one of the enduring questions surrounding his legacy. By the time the war had truly begun to turn, by the winter of 1942 and into the spring of 1943, Hausser found himself in a position of extraordinary influence, yet one shadowed increasingly by the awareness that the tide had shifted beneath him. The victories that had seemed so inevitable, so mathematically certain in those early blitzkrieg years, had given way to something far more costly and far more desperate. And it was in this moment, when Germany's strategic position had begun its slow, relentless decline, that Hausser's role within the SS apparatus deepened in ways that would come to define his legacy, for better and for worse. His command of the SS Panzer Corps had given him both genuine military authority and a sphere of operational independence that many Wehrmacht officers envied, though few would have dared admit it. The Waffen-SS, which had grown from those early ideologically driven formations into a substantial military force with multiple corps, multiple divisions, represented something altogether different from the traditional German army. Where the Wehrmacht answered to the high command and, ultimately, to the field marshal hierarchy, the Waffen-SS remained, in many ways, an autonomous institution, answerable to Himmler, accountable through the SS chain of command, yet increasingly relied upon in critical battles. And Hausser, as one of its most capable operational commanders, stood at the intersection of military necessity and ideological purpose in a way that few officers of any army have ever experienced. The question that historians often grapple with, in those quiet moments of research and reflection, is whether Hausser viewed himself primarily as a soldier serving the state, or whether he recognized, perhaps consciously, perhaps only half aware, that the state he served had become something fundamentally aberrant. The documentary evidence suggests a man caught between two truths. He was genuinely concerned with military professionalism, with the welfare of his men, with conducting operations according to recognized standards. Yet he remained, simultaneously, embedded within a system designed to serve purposes that transcended the merely military, a system designed to enact racial ideology through force. In the winter of 1942 to 1943, as the Eastern Front contracted and German forces began their long retreat from the Don, Hausser's SS Panzer Corps was engaged in some of the most brutal and grinding warfare Europe had yet witnessed. The fighting at Stalingrad, though Hausser's corps was not directly present for that catastrophe, echoed in every order, every casualty report, every supply requisition. The Waffen-SS divisions under his general authority were being committed to desperate counteroffensives, to desperate defensive actions, to battles where the calculus of victory had become almost meaningless. Survival had become the primary calculation. It was during this period that Hausser's administrative and organizational skills proved most valuable. A commander could be brave, could be inspired, could demonstrate tactical brilliance in small engagements. But maintaining a complex military apparatus, under conditions of progressive resource scarcity, under conditions where supplies grew ever more difficult to obtain, under conditions where the industrial base supporting the army was itself coming under increasing attack from the air, this required something altogether different. This required the ability to manage systems, to extract maximum efficiency from shrinking resources, to maintain morale and cohesion among soldiers who increasingly understood that the outcome of the war was no longer in doubt. Hausser proved capable in all these dimensions, and his reputation grew accordingly. Officers who served under him, who survived the war, and who later wrote memoirs and granted interviews, often recalled him as fair-minded within the context of total war, as capable of making difficult decisions without apparent hesitation, and as someone who seemed genuinely concerned with preserving his force for future operations. Whether this concern stemmed from genuine solicitude for his men, or whether it was rooted instead in pragmatic calculation about the need to preserve combat capability, remains an open question that each reader and listener must settle within themselves. The strategic situation, meanwhile, continued its slow collapse. The German victory at Kharkov in March 1943, a significant tactical success in which German forces, including elements of Hausser's corps, recaptured a major Soviet city in a counteroffensive operation, proved to be, in retrospect, one of the last clear German victories on the Eastern Front. By the summer, the Soviets would launch Operation Kutuzov, a massive offensive that would, in turn, drive German forces back yet again, setting in motion a cycle of retreat, punctuated by brief, exhausting counterattacks that would characterize the remainder of the war in the East. One might ask, in this context, whether Hausser believed such victories meaningfully altered the trajectory of the war. By 1943, the strategic mathematics had become overwhelmingly unfavorable. Germany was now engaged in a two-front conflict against industrial powers possessed of vastly greater productive capacity. The Soviet Union, despite its enormous losses, continued to mobilize fresh forces at a rate the Germans could not match. The Western Allies, having secured North Africa and Sicily, were preparing the invasion that would crack open the western border of Hitler's Europe. Japan, meanwhile, was being steadily pushed back across the Pacific by American forces that seemed to multiply endlessly. The mathematics suggested not victory, but defeat, inevitable, inexorable defeat, arriving as a function of time and industrial capacity rather than as a result of any particular battle or campaign. Did Hausser understand this? Did he recognize, in the spring and summer of 1943, that victory was no longer possible, that the question had shifted from how to win the war to how to manage the nation's inevitable defeat? Historical records suggest he maintained, outwardly at least, a professional focus on the immediate operational situation. He continued to execute orders, to improve his formations, to prepare for the operations his superiors commanded. And in this, perhaps, he was no different from many officers in many armies at many times in history. Men and women who, confronted with circumstances beyond their control, chose to focus on what lay within their sphere of influence and responsibility, and set aside the larger metaphysical and strategic questions that might otherwise have paralyzed them with despair. Yet it remains true that by this point in the war, by 1943, Hausser had become not merely a military commander, but a figure of considerable prominence within the Nazi state, a man whose competence was recognized and relied upon, and whose close association with the Waffen-SS, and with the SS more broadly, meant that his choices and actions were, in some degree, implicated in the larger purposes that organization served. The question of his moral and historical culpability, a question that scholars and historians continue to debate, and that perhaps can never be fully resolved, is bound up inextricably with this reality. By the spring of 1943, as the Eastern Front hardened into a grinding attrition that would consume hundreds of thousands of lives, Hausser found himself in a peculiar position of influence. The Waffen-SS had grown far beyond the personal bodyguard formation it had once been. What had begun as a few thousand ideologically motivated men had swollen into an armed force that rivaled in some ways the Wehrmacht itself, divided into corps and divisions, equipped with tanks and artillery, embedded in major operations from Ukraine to France. And Hausser, now in his 60s, remained the architect most intimately familiar with the machinery of its organization, even as political winds shifted beneath the Reich's surface. The thing worth understanding here is that Hausser's authority, by this stage, derived not from explicit Nazi Party membership. He had never joined the SS as a political organization in the way Himmler had, but rather from a deep professional respect earned through relentless attention to military competence. His officers knew him as a disciplinarian who cared less about the grandiose racial theories that saturated SS ideology and more about whether a division could maneuver, hold a line, and conserve casualties. It was a subtle distinction, but it mattered enormously in the daily workings of the Waffen-SS, where bureaucratic infighting and ideological posturing often strangled practical effectiveness. Hausser moved through these conflicts with a kind of calculated quietness, rarely raising his voice, preferring to work through the channels of command and favor that he had spent 2 decades building. In the East, the Waffen-SS divisions were performing with a ferocity that was becoming legendary among both German and Soviet commanders. The Das Reich Division, the Totenkopf Division, the Wiking Division, each of these formations had acquired a reputation for fanaticism in attack and resilience in defense that made them valuable assets in Zeitzler's operational planning. Yet this reputation came at a cost. The casualty rates in the SS divisions, on average, ran higher than comparable Wehrmacht units. Whether this resulted from recklessness, from ideological commitment that overrode caution, or from the fact that the toughest sectors of the front were often assigned to these formations, is a question that historians still examine with careful nuance. The records suggest it was some mixture of all three. What Hausser watched with growing concern, though, was not merely the mounting losses. Those were, in his view, an inevitable price of modern industrial warfare, but rather the supply situation and the broader strategic picture. By 1943, the Reich's industrial capacity, for all its impressive mobilization, could not sustain indefinitely the rate of attrition on the Eastern Front, the Waffen-SS, precisely because it had become so central to German offensive operations, consumed enormous quantities of replacement personnel and equipment. And unlike the Wehrmacht, which could draw from a vast pool of conscripted soldiers, the Waffen-SS relied increasingly on volunteers from occupied territories, Belgians, Dutchmen, Scandinavians, and more problematically, various Eastern European and even Soviet collaborators whose loyalty and capability varied widely. The organization Hausser had built had achieved enormous growth, but that growth had come at the cost of coherence and ideological purity, if you will, in the strict sense that the early SS men had possessed. This tension created a peculiar ironies within Hausser's own sphere of influence. The military professional in him wanted to optimize the fighting force, to select leaders and men based on capability, and to allocate resources according to strategic necessity. But the apparatus he served was, by definition, a Nazi organization, rooted in racial ideology and connected inextricably to the SS state's darker enterprises. Hausser himself was not indifferent to these realities, but he operated within them as a man of his time and position might, aware perhaps of contradictions, but not moved to act decisively against the system that granted him authority. This is not an unusual pattern among military bureaucrats in totalitarian states, though it is worth naming directly rather than obscuring it with euphemism. During this period, Hausser was also working to formalize the training and organizational doctrine of the Waffen-SS in ways that would outlast the war itself. He recognized, even then, that the conflict would eventually end, and he was concerned with preserving the intellectual capital and institutional memory of what had been built. He sponsored the creation of detailed training manuals, encouraged the recording of operational lessons learned, and worked to establish a kind of officer education system within the Waffen-SS that could stand comparison with the Wehrmacht's own military academies. It was foresight of a sort, though foresight toward what end is a question that hovers over the historical record with considerable weight. The personal cost to Hausser himself was not insignificant. The loss of his arm had been replaced with a prosthetic, which, in an era without modern materials, was uncomfortable and limiting. He was advancing in years, and the intensity of his responsibilities showed in his correspondence and in accounts from those who met with him regularly. Yet he maintained a regimen of work that would have exhausted men half his age. His adjutants reported that he could often be found in his office late into the evening, reviewing reports, annotating operational plans, drafting memoranda. There was, perhaps, an element of obsession in this, a sense that the entire structure of the Waffen-SS depended in some fundamental way on his continued vigilance and guidance. And perhaps, in some sense, it did. The Waffen-SS was not a democratic institution, and it did not run on consensus. It depended on the authority and the will of strong men to function, and Hausser had become, whether he fully acknowledged it or not, the closest thing to a moral center that the organization possessed. His reputation for relative fairness, his apparent lack of interest in the Byzantine SS political games, his focus on military outcomes rather than ideological purity, these qualities made him, in the eyes of many senior SS officers and even Wehrmacht commanders, the most trustworthy figure within the Waffen-SS command structure. What that trust was built upon, and what it would eventually demand of him, were questions that remained suspended in the fog of war, waiting to be answered by events that no man in 1943 could fully anticipate. The machinery of war, once set in motion by ideology and ambition, develops its own momentum, its own logic, independent of the men who first imagined it. And in the case of the Waffen-SS by the early 1940s, that machinery had become something far larger than even Hausser himself had conceived. A military organization that would eventually field 500,000 men across the continent, men drawn from across occupied Europe, from every corner of the Third Reich's expanding dominion. One might wonder how a single officer, however brilliant his administrative mind, could have shaped such an enormous force. The answer lies in understanding that Hausser did not work alone, though his fingerprints remained on nearly every foundational decision. By 1942, as the war deepened and stretched across impossible distances, from the frozen steppe of Russia to the deserts of North Africa, the demands on the Waffen-SS became almost biblical in scale. Hausser found himself not merely training formations, but essentially creating the officer corps that would staff an ever-expanding military machine. The recruitment drives intensified, where once they had sought only the most racially pure, the most ideologically committed, the standards began imperceptibly to shift. Necessity, that old corrosive force, wore away at rigid doctrine. Men from Germanic ethnic backgrounds outside the Reich, Norwegians, Danes, Flemings, were welcomed into the fold, and then, as the war ground on, and losses mounted beyond imagination, even those standards would bend further still, drawing in Ukrainians, Bosnians, and dozens of other nationalities whose ideological purity was questionable at best. Hausser himself seemed to navigate these contradictions with a peculiar compartmentalization that perhaps allowed him to function in an increasingly morally compromised world. He maintained his public persona as the ascetic military reformer, the administrator obsessed with technical excellence and proper training methodology. His correspondence from this period reveals a man preoccupied with logistics, with the proper organization of supply lines, with ensuring that new recruits received adequate instruction in fieldcraft and weapons handling. One can almost picture him bent over reports late into the evening, annotating margins with meticulous German precision, concerned that a training deficiency here or an organizational gap there might cost lives in combat. And yet this same man presided over an organization that was increasingly implicated in atrocities, in actions that went far beyond the bounds of conventional warfare. It is a peculiarly human capacity, this ability to fragment one's consciousness, to maintain separate compartments of awareness, so that the full moral weight of one's circumstances need not be simultaneously borne. How much did Hausser genuinely know about the actions of the units under his command? How much did he willfully decline to know? These are questions that historians have debated for decades, and the honest answer is that we cannot fully enter another mind, cannot precisely calibrate the degree of willful blindness or genuine ignorance that characterized his awareness. What we can say is that his command structure, his insistence on discipline and professionalism, sometimes functioned as a kind of moral buffer, a way of maintaining the fiction that what the Waffen-SS did in the field was purely military in nature, untainted by the racial ideology that had created it. And yet the ideology was always there, embedded in the very structures Hausser had built, the selection processes, the training regimens, the officer corps indoctrination. All of it was saturated with National Socialist racial theory. One could not build the Waffen-SS as Hausser had built it without simultaneously building a machine for implementing Nazi racial policy. The two things were inseparable, even if, or perhaps especially if, one refused to acknowledge the connection. In the quiet of one's mind, in the privacy of one's conscience, there is always room to tell oneself a different story. By 1943, Hausser himself was becoming something of a legend within the organization he had created. Officers and men spoke of him with a mixture of respect and a kind of awe, the austere, aging military professional who had transformed a political militia into what at least appeared to be a proper military force. His appearance had a way of commanding attention. Photographs from this period show a man who seemed almost timeless, with sharp features and steel-grey eyes that suggested absolute focus and unshakable conviction. He had become the living embodiment of the idea that the Waffen-SS was something separate from the SS proper, something more purely military in its ethos and concerns. This image, whether carefully cultivated or the natural result of his personality and approach, served a crucial psychological function both for those within the organization and for the broader officer corps of the Wehrmacht. It created the possibility of narrative separation, the idea that one could serve in the Waffen-SS, could build a respectable military career, could do what soldiers had always done, without necessarily acknowledging the ideological foundations upon which everything rested. The Waffen-SS men, this narrative went, were simply soldiers doing their duty, following orders, executing the military missions assigned to them. And if their organization was founded on racial principle and served racial ends, well, that was a political matter, not a military one. That was the burden of the politicians and the ideology makers, not the professionals in uniform. How tempting such a division must have been, how necessary even, for those who wished to maintain a sense of honor or professional pride in their service. And Hausser, with his precise military bearing, his obvious competence, his focus on technique and training rather than ideology, embodied this possibility. One could point to him as evidence that it was possible to serve in the Nazi military structure without being a true believer, without surrendering one's military professionalism to ideological fervor. He represented, in other words, a kind of ethical loophole, the notion that one could be implicated in vast systems of oppression while maintaining one's personal integrity through a scrupulous attention to one's professional duties. Whether such a division was genuinely possible, or whether it was merely a comfortable fiction, remains one of the enduring moral questions raised by the study of the Nazi regime. The reality on the ground, however, was far messier and far less amenable to such clean separations. As the Waffen-SS divisions moved into combat, particularly on the Eastern Front where the racial war took on its most brutal character, The gap between the ideal of professional soldiering and the actual conduct of those troops widened considerably. Units under Hausser's authority participated in actions that violated every convention of warfare. Mass executions of civilians, collective reprisals, the use of forced labor, the destruction of entire communities. These were not aberrations committed by rogue elements, but systematic practices that flowed naturally from the ideological foundations and military structure of the organization. And yet Hausser's post-war testimony and memoir would present a narrative in which he bore little responsibility for these acts, in which he had done his best to maintain professional military standards within an impossible political situation. The interesting question, and perhaps a slightly troubling one, is whether we should accept this narrative at face value, or whether we should recognize it as a sophisticated form of what might be called organizational compartmentalization. Hausser was not a man who personally participated in massacres. He was not present at the scene of major atrocities. His direct orders, as far as we can determine from the historical record, did not explicitly command units to commit war crimes. And yet he built the machine, set its character, established its standards and expectations. The moral culpability that flows from such distant, structural responsibility is subtly different from direct participation, and perhaps that difference mattered to Hausser as it has mattered to many who occupied similar positions in history. But the distinction between building a weapon and firing it, between creating a system and operating within it, grows increasingly tenuous the more closely one examines the actual conduct of that system in practice. The Waffen-SS that took shape under Hausser's hand was not, in those early years after his appointment, the monolithic terror machine it would become. It was rather something altogether more fragile and uncertain, a military unit caught between ideology and practicality, between the demands of a political movement and the cold requirements of warfare. And in that space between two worlds, Hausser found himself navigating a peculiar kind of authority, one that required him to speak two languages fluently, the language of the Wehrmacht officer corps and the dialect of Nazi ideological commitment. By the time he had consolidated his position as inspector of the SS-Verfügungstruppe in the late 1930s, Hausser had already begun implementing what historians would later recognize as a crucial transformation. He introduced systematic officer training programs that, while they certainly incorporated racial ideology and Nazi doctrine, also emphasized conventional military discipline, tactical proficiency, and what might be called professional competence. It was as though he understood, almost instinctively, that an army that could not fight effectively was an army that would not survive long enough to serve any purpose at all, ideological or otherwise. The contradiction was there, woven into the very fabric of the institution he was building. Yet he pressed forward with a clarity of vision that suggests he had made a choice about what would ultimately matter most. His influence extended into the realm of recruitment as well. Where the SS had previously drawn its members from the ranks of committed party activists and ideological zealots, Hausser began to broaden the net, reaching for younger men with athletic ability and leadership potential, many of whom came to the organization not primarily as true believers, but simply as young Germans seeking military service and advancement. This shift, subtle though it was, represented a kind of quiet revolution within the SS itself. The organization was becoming less a purely ideological brotherhood and more something resembling a conventional military service arm, albeit one that maintained the SS uniform, SS structure, and SS symbolism. Was Hausser deliberately diluting the ideological purity of the SS, or was he simply recognizing that a larger, more capable force would require a broader recruitment base? The answer remains shadowed by time, but the outcome was clear enough. Under his tenure, the Waffen-SS began to grow in both size and, arguably, in genuine military capability. The training facilities he established set new standards for German military instruction. At the SS Junkerschule Bad Tölz and other academies under his purview, cadets underwent rigorous courses in leadership, tactics, weapons handling, and combined arms warfare. Instructors were selected for their competence as military educators, not solely for their party credentials. Physical training was intense: long marches through alpine terrain, survival exercises, weapons drills that sometimes lasted through the night. Yet alongside this brutal practical instruction, cadets also received systematic indoctrination in Nazi ideology, in concepts of racial hierarchy, in the spiritual mission of the SS as Hausser and the party leadership understood it. The two streams flowed together, impossible to fully separate, each reinforcing the other in ways both obvious and insidiously subtle. What made Hausser's approach distinctive, even in this morally compromised context, was his insistence on merit-based advancement and his willingness to dismiss or reassign officers who proved incapable in the field, regardless of their ideological fervor or party connections. This meritocratic impulse, while it might seem unremarkable in a conventional military organization, was actually quite radical within the SS, an institution where party loyalty and ideological correctness had historically trumped all other considerations. Officers who served under him learned that they could not simply mouth the proper slogans and expect to keep their positions. They had to actually command effectively, had to understand tactics, had to be able to lead men under fire. In this way, Hausser began to professionalize the Waffen-SS, to transform it from an irregular paramilitary force into something approaching a real army, complete with all the hierarchies, protocols, and professional standards that such an organization entailed. The relationship between Hausser and Heinrich Himmler, the Reichswehr SS, and one of the most powerful figures in Nazi Germany, was one of mutual respect, but also subtle tension. Himmler wanted the SS to be, above all else, a force of ideological purity, a biological and spiritual elite that embodied Nazi racial doctrine and would serve as the vanguard of the Nazi project's most ambitious goals. Hausser, by contrast, wanted an organization that could actually win battles, that could hold ground, that could inflict casualties on the enemy and suffer losses while continuing to function as a coherent military force. These two visions were not entirely incompatible, but neither were they entirely aligned. Himmler tolerated Hausser's professionalization efforts, in part because the Waffen-SS's growing military effectiveness reflected well on him and enhanced his power and prestige within the Nazi state. But there were always limits to this tolerance, always a ceiling beyond which Hausser's pragmatism could not push his ambitions. During the late 1930s, as war drew ever closer on the European horizon, Hausser's institutional work took on an increasingly urgent character. The Spanish Civil War, where German units had tested themselves against Republican forces, had provided valuable lessons about how modern warfare actually functioned, lessons that Hausser studied carefully and incorporated into his training protocols. He understood that the Waffen-SS would not face colonial subjects or poorly equipped militia forces. It would face other European armies, including eventually the world's largest standing army, the Soviet Union. This knowledge, this clear-eyed assessment of the scale and severity of the challenges ahead, animated his work and gave it a particular direction. He was not simply building an organization for the sake of organizational growth. He was building a force that he believed could actually survive and prevail in a continental war. The expansion of the Waffen-SS accelerated as the decade wore on. What had been a relatively small formation of perhaps 5,000 men in the early 1930s had grown to over 30,000 by 1939, with more recruitment and training ongoing constantly. This growth brought with it all manner of complications and challenges. The more the organization expanded, the more difficult it became to maintain strict ideological uniformity, the more one had to rely on conventional military training and discipline rather than shared commitment to Nazi ideology. It was in some sense inevitable that an organization trying to expand this rapidly while maintaining both military effectiveness and ideological orthodoxy would find itself pulled in different directions, would develop internal contradictions that could not be entirely resolved. Hausser's administrative style was notably different from that of many other senior SS officers. He was punctilious, attentive to detail, concerned with efficiency and rational organization. He kept extensive records, demanded accountability from his subordinates, and was willing to admit when something was not working and needed to be changed. In the deeply personal, often chaotic power structures of the Nazi state, where patronage and personal loyalty frequently trumped formal authority, Hausser's bureaucratic approach marked him as something of an anomaly. Some senior party figures viewed him with a kind of wary respect, recognizing his competence while remaining uncertain whether his lack of ideological fervor, his cold professional demeanor, represented a strength or a potential liability. As the 1930s gave way to the war years, Hausser had established himself as a figure of substantial influence within the Nazi military apparatus, yet also as someone whose ultimate loyalties and deepest convictions remained, in some ways, opaque. Was he a true believer in the Nazi cause, committed to its ideological mission, or was he a professional soldier who had simply adapted himself to the demands of the political environment in which he found himself? Perhaps the answer lies somewhere in between, in the grey spaces where ideology and pragmatism intermix, where a person can believe in certain aspects of a regime's vision while remaining skeptical of others, while simply doing the job assigned to them to the best of their considerable ability. By the spring of 1943, Hausser's vision for the Waffen-SS had begun to crystallize into something far more tangible than doctrine or theoretical organization. The divisions under his command, men drawn from across the Reich and its occupied territories, had begun to develop a reputation that preceded them. Not always a favorable one, the Das Reich division, for instance, had already earned a grim notoriety for the ferocity of its counterinsurgency operations in occupied France, and this raised questions that would follow Hausser throughout his career about where military excellence ended and war crime began. But in his own assessment, he believed he was building something unprecedented, a force that transcended the traditional boundaries of the German army, a truly pan-European military entity that could draw upon talent and commitment from beyond the Reich's racial boundaries. Hausser's personal command style had by this point become something of a study unto itself among both his superiors and subordinates. He was known to be remarkably accessible for a man of his rank. Officers and even enlisted men could approach him with concerns, and he would listen with what observers described as genuine attention. This accessibility masked, however, a profoundly exacting standard. He expected precision, discipline, and absolute clarity of purpose. In training exercises, he would often position himself at the front lines alongside his men, observing their movements with the eye of someone who had spent decades studying military science. Do you wonder what such a commanding presence might have communicated to young soldiers, many of them ideologically molded from childhood? Perhaps a sense that their sacrifice was being witnessed, understood, and given shape by someone who truly comprehended what he was asking of them. The logistics of maintaining and expanding the Waffen-SS during wartime were, of course, staggering. Even as the Eastern Front consumed men and materiel at an almost inconceivable rate, Hausser continued to petition Berlin for resources to form new divisions, to rotate experienced units back for training and refitting, to ensure that the force remained coherent and capable. This was not mere ambition, though ambition certainly played a role. It was an attempt to maintain an organizational vision in the face of increasingly chaotic circumstances. The Wehrmacht was by this period beginning to fray at its edges. The Luftwaffe was unable to provide adequate air cover. Supplies were becoming sporadic, yet the Waffen-SS, under Hausser's stewardship, retained a degree of self-sufficiency and organizational integrity that was almost anomalous. Part of this capability rested upon Hausser's relationships with other power centers within the Nazi regime. His connection to Heinrich Himmler had remained stable, if not always warm. They shared a vision, at least on paper, of what the SS should become, though they differed significantly on methods and on how that transformation should be achieved. Hausser was, in many respects, a modernizer, someone who believed that efficiency and rational organization could be improved through study and innovation. Himmler, by contrast, was driven by ideological conviction and a mystical attachment to certain SS traditions and symbols. These differences created a productive tension. Himmler would support Hausser's military initiatives, at least when they did not contradict his broader political objectives, while Hausser maintained a careful distance from some of the more explicitly ideological dimensions of Himmler's vision. By 1943, too, the nature of Hausser's command had shifted in a subtle but significant way. The Waffen-SS divisions were no longer auxiliary forces available for special operations. They had become integral to German military planning on the Eastern Front. Whole army corps were structured around them. The Wehrmacht commanders, initially skeptical of the SS as a military organization, had come to rely upon them in critical situations. This elevation in status was not accidental. It was the result of careful cultivation by Hausser, of consistent military performance, and of the sheer necessity imposed by a two-front war that was consuming the Reich's resources faster than they could be replenished. The Waffen-SS was becoming, in effect, the Wehrmacht's emergency reserve, deployed to the most critical points on the front whenever crisis threatened. The human cost of this arrangement, however, was something that existed in a peculiar sort of suspension in Hausser's official correspondence and public statements. The casualty rates among Waffen-SS divisions were, as a rule, significantly higher than those of comparable Wehrmacht formations. This was partly because they were deployed to the most desperate situations, partly because their officers were trained to pursue aggressive tactics, and partly because their men were expected to maintain discipline and cohesion even in circumstances of profound chaos. When a division was surrounded, when supply lines were cut, when the enemy appeared capable of overrunning the position, Waffen-SS units were expected to hold, and they often did. But what does such expectation mean when spread across thousands of young men, many of them barely out of their teens? These were questions that the historical record suggests Hausser did not pause to examine in any depth, or if he did, he kept such examinations private. In the spring and early summer of 1943, Hausser was preparing for what would become one of the largest tank battles in human history. The Germans were planning Operation Citadel, the assault on the Kursk salient, and the Waffen-SS divisions under his command would form a crucial component of the attacking force. For months, Hausser coordinated with the Wehrmacht commands, participated in planning meetings, reviewed intelligence assessments. He believed that the coming operation could turn the tide on the Eastern Front. This belief was, in a sense, both professionally necessary and personally compelling. To acknowledge that Germany could no longer win seemed, to men of his generation and position, almost impossible. By the autumn of 1944, the military landscape of Nazi Germany had shifted into something altogether different from the assured vision Hausser had cultivated in those earlier years of rapid expansion and apparent invulnerability. The Wehrmacht was contracting on all fronts. Soviet armies pressed westward with relentless momentum. The Allies had broken out of Normandy and were sweeping across France, and within this narrowing space, the Waffen-SS found itself deployed not as an elite vanguard of conquest, but as a desperate instrument of containment, fighting battles it could no longer hope to win with the resources and manpower that remained available to it. Hausser himself, now in his 60s, bore the accumulated weight of those years of command. His health had begun to deteriorate, though he refused to step away from active duty. There is something both tragic and revealing about a man who had built an entire military philosophy around youth, vigor, and the idea of selecting the finest specimens of manhood, now commanding those forces as his own body weakened and aged. He remained stationed in various capacities along the crumbling front, observing firsthand how the doctrine he had established was being tested against enemies who had learned to counter his tactics, who possessed superior resources, and who no longer operated under the illusions that had once seemed so certain. The ISS Panzer Corps, which Hausser had shaped into a formidable fighting force, was now committed to Operation Barbarossa's continuation in the east, and simultaneously tasked with emergency deployments to shore up failing sectors along the Western Front. These men, many of them the product of Hausser's own recruitment and training philosophies, were being asked to accomplish the impossible: hold the line, prevent the encirclement, defend territory that had already been lost in the minds of Germany's military planners, if not yet on the map. What strikes one, when examining the historical record of this period, is how Hausser's response was not one of despair or capitulation, but rather a kind of intensified focus on the immediate tactical requirements before him. He continued to advocate for the Waffen-SS, to argue that if given sufficient resources, sufficient manpower, and sufficient freedom to operate according to its own principles, it could still achieve meaningful results. Whether this represented genuine conviction or a kind of psychological necessity, the unwillingness of a career soldier to acknowledge the fundamental direction of events remains open to interpretation. Perhaps it was both. The attrition rates were staggering. Men who had been trained in the elite academies and selection centers were being fed into a meat grinder of modern industrial warfare, artillery barrages from Soviet guns that numbered in the thousands, air superiority belonging almost entirely to the Allied powers. The kind of warfare that had characterized the early successes of the Wehrmacht, rapid movement, concentrated force, operational surprise, had become nearly impossible to execute. Yet the Waffen-SS divisions continued to fight, continued to inflict casualties on their enemies, and continued to uphold the rigid discipline and organizational structures that Hausser had embedded into their very nature. There are accounts from this period that suggest Hausser was acutely aware of the war's trajectory, that behind closed doors he may have harbored doubts about ultimate victory. Yet to his subordinates, to the men under his command, he maintained a bearing of resolute determination. How does a leader manage that duality? How does one continue to organize and direct military operations with full commitment, while privately understanding, perhaps, that those operations are ultimately futile? It is a psychological and moral question that extends far beyond the particulars of Hausser's situation, though his situation illuminates it with particular clarity. By late 1944, rumors of peace negotiations had begun to circulate through various channels. Some elements within the Nazi regime, including elements of the military, were beginning to explore, cautiously and in isolation from one another, whether there might be any possibility of negotiating a separate peace, particularly with the Western Allies. These were tentative, often contradictory efforts, frequently sabotaged by the paranoia and centralized decision-making that characterized Nazi governance. Hausser, insofar as the records indicate, was not directly involved in these machinations, though he was certainly aware of the broader political and strategic ferment occurring around him. His focus remained on the operational level, on the next battle, the next defensive line, the next tactical problem to be solved, with the resources and men available to him. There is perhaps something almost monastic about such focus, a narrowing of vision that allows one to function in contexts where a broader perspective might lead to paralysis. In that sense, Hausser represented a particular type of military man, one whose training and temperament oriented him toward the immediate and the concrete, rather than toward grand strategic questions or political considerations that lay outside his purview. The Eastern Front, where SS Panzerkorps continued to see heavy action, had become a landscape of apocalyptic destruction by this stage of the war. Soviet operations had matured considerably since 1941. The Red Army was no longer the somewhat disorganized force that had been vulnerable to German encirclement operations. It had become a sophisticated, coordinated instrument, capable of executing massive encirclement operations of its own, capable of sustaining logistical lines across vast distances, capable of inflicting losses that the Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS could no longer replace. The human cost, on both sides, had become almost incomprehensible. Millions of soldiers had already been killed, wounded, or captured, yet the machinery of war ground on, consuming men and material with an appetite that seemed inexhaustible. Hausser's divisions fought through that autumn and into the early winter of 1945 with a tenacity that impressed even enemy commanders. The question becomes, what sustained that resistance? Was it the ideological commitment that Hausser had worked so carefully to instill in his men, years earlier, in the selection centers and training academies? Was it the brotherhood and unit cohesion that develops among men who have fought together through crisis after crisis? Was it fear? Fear of capture by Soviet forces? Fear of what might await them if they were taken prisoner? Or was it simply the momentum of institutional survival, the tendency of military organizations to continue functioning according to their programming, even when the broader context that gave meaning to that functioning has collapsed? The answer, almost certainly, involved some element of all of these things, in proportions that likely varied from man to man, from unit to unit. By the spring of 1943, the divisions under Hausser's command had begun to crystallize into something historically peculiar, a force that possessed genuine military capability, yet existed alongside, and often in competition with the regular Wehrmacht. The Das Reich Division, the Totenkopf Division, and the Wiking Division, each under Waffen-SS officers who had internalized Hausser's doctrine, were becoming operationally indispensable on the Eastern Front. And this paradox gnawed at both the Wehrmacht's general staff and the Nazi Party leadership, because it raised an uncomfortable question: who truly controlled Germany's military future? Hausser himself, now in his early 60s, occupied a peculiar position. He was not a Nazi Party ideologue in the way Himmler was, nor was he a pure military technician like some Wehrmacht generals. Instead, he embodied a middle ground, a professional soldier who had modernized the Waffen-SS into an effective combat force, while maintaining enough of the SS's ideological infrastructure to preserve his authority within the party. It was a balance that required constant attention, constant calibration. One false step, and he risked appearing either insufficiently committed to Nazi principles or too compromised by military pragmatism. The Battle of Kursk, which unfolded across July and August of 1943, became the proving ground for Hausser's vision. This was to be Operation Citadel, the Wehrmacht's last major offensive on the Eastern Front, a colossal encirclement designed to crush Soviet forces in a bulge of terrain known as the Kursk salient. The operation involved hundreds of thousands of troops, including substantial Waffen-SS contingents. Hausser, by then promoted to Obergruppenführer, commanded the EII's Panzer Corps, which included some of the most battle-hardened divisions in his organization. What made Kursk significant for understanding Hausser's legacy was not merely the scale of the battle, but what his performance there revealed about the relationship between military competence and ideological loyalty. The Soviet defenses at Kursk were formidable, deep, layered, prepared with meticulous care over weeks. The Germans had known the Soviets would be ready. Intelligence had suggested that Soviet fortifications were among the most extensive ever constructed. Yet the operation proceeded anyway, because the German High Command believed that superior tactics and unit cohesion could overcome numerical disadvantage and prepared positions. Hausser's NES's Panzer Corps performed, by most military assessments, with considerable effectiveness. The divisions under his command broke through Soviet defensive lines in places where Wehrmacht units struggled. They displayed the kind of aggressive maneuvering and coordinated firepower that had become the hallmark of Waffen-SS mechanized formations. Losses were severe, catastrophic in fact, by any rational accounting, but the tactical results suggested that Hausser's methods had created formations capable of extraordinary violence and persistence. Yet even in victory, or what the Germans could claim as partial success, the human cost was becoming impossibly visible. The casualty figures from Kursk astounded even hardened veterans. The Soviet defense was so unyielding that German divisions reported losses running to 30, sometimes 40% of personnel. And for what? The strategic situation continued to deteriorate. The Soviets had the depth of territory, the vast reserves of manpower, the industrial capacity to absorb losses and rebuild. Germany did not. This is where Hausser's role begins to become more ambiguous, more troubling in the historical record. Because at this precise moment, when the fundamental futility of continued offensive operations should have become evident even to the most committed Nazi leadership, Hausser seems to have remained convinced not only of the Waffen-SS's military value, but of the necessity of expanding it further. Was this genuine belief in a military solution that no longer existed? Was it the momentum of a man who had devoted decades to building an institution and could not stop? Or was there something else, some calculation about power and position within the collapsing German state that was beginning to guide his thinking? The documents from this period are often frustratingly sparse on Hausser's internal motivations. He wrote sparse memoirs, gave few interviews of any depth about his state of mind during the latter war years. What we have are orders, reports, official correspondence, the external architecture of command, but not the private doubts or convictions that may have haunted a man watching his creation bleed itself into irrelevance across the vastness of the Soviet Union. What we do know is that after Kursk, Hausser remained deeply involved in strategic planning for SS operations. He continued to advocate for the Waffen-SS as a distinct and superior military organization. He participated in discussions about the formation of new divisions, the recruitment of foreign volunteers, the integration of increasing numbers of non-German personnel into the Waffen-SS structure. These were not the actions of a man who had abandoned his life's work. They were the actions of a man doubling down, perhaps with the kind of determination that comes from knowing that one's entire worldview is being tested and might not survive intact. The period between Kursk and the Soviet counteroffensive represented, in some ways, the last moment when the German military command could realistically have advocated for a fundamental strategic reorientation, a shift away from offensive operations toward a defensive posture focused on preserving military capability and territorial integrity. Some Wehrmacht generals did quietly suggest such approaches, but Hausser and the broader Waffen-SS leadership seemed locked into a paradigm in which continued commitment, continued sacrifice, and continued organizational expansion remained the only acceptable responses to deteriorating circumstances. There is something almost tragic, in the classical sense, about this moment in Hausser's career. A man who had been a genuine innovator in military organization, who had created something new and effective, now found himself committed to an institution that could not fundamentally alter its direction, that could not admit doubt or reformulate strategy, that was bound by ideological imperatives that transcended rational military calculation. The institution Hausser had fathered now held him within its logic as surely as he had once shaped it. By the spring of 1943, the Waffen-SS had become something Paul Hausser could scarcely have imagined when he first stepped into the parade ground at the Bad Tölz officer school years before. What had begun as an experimental corps of ideologically motivated volunteers had evolved into a military force of formidable size and reputation, and increasingly, of questionable provenance. The very purity of character he had once insisted upon as the cornerstone of SS selection was beginning to dissolve under the pressure of unending warfare and mounting casualties. The Eastern Front had become, by that time, a crucible of unprecedented brutality. And here we must pause and acknowledge what historians have long grappled with. Hausser's role in that landscape remains deeply contested terrain. He maintained, throughout his life, that the Waffen-SS under his command adhered to military discipline and the Geneva Conventions. Yet the documentary record, witness testimonies, photographs, unit reports from the field, tells a more complicated story. Not every atrocity can be laid at the feet of one commander, and not every soldier under the SS banner shared identical convictions or conduct. But the institution itself, the machine Hausser had helped perfect, did not operate in moral isolation. It operated within the framework of a regime conducting industrial genocide. How does a military leader of genuine tactical skill navigate such a moral abyss? Perhaps he cannot. Perhaps he does not try. By 1943, recruitment into the Waffen-SS had shifted dramatically. No longer were volunteers carefully screened for their ideological purity and physical specimens of Aryan virtue. The organization was hemorrhaging men on the steppes of Russia, in the frozen trenches around Stalingrad, in the grinding warfare of North Africa. The replacements came from occupied territories, from ethnic Germans living across Eastern Europe, from conscripted Volksdeutsche, ethnic Germans, who had little choice in the matter. The SS divisions of the later war years bore less resemblance to the elite formations that Hausser had cultivated than they did to conventional German army units, hastily reinforced and pushed into crisis situations. And yet Hausser's reputation, his operational record, only seemed to rise. By 1943, he had been promoted to command the Ili S Panzer Corps, a significant advancement that placed him in control of multiple divisions and thousands upon thousands of men. It was a position of real power, one that reflected the high regard in which the Nazi leadership held him. The Panzer Corps would operate as a mobile strike force, moved across the map in response to Soviet advances and German defensive needs. In this role, Hausser became, in essence, a field marshal of sorts, answerable directly to the highest levels of German military command. The Battle of Kursk in July of 1943 stands as perhaps the largest tank engagement in human history. The Soviets, having broken the German line at Stalingrad and pushed westward, had prepared an enormous trap. They constructed 3 lines of heavily fortified defences across the Kursk salient, a vast bulge in the front line, and positioned enormous reserves behind those defences, waiting. The Germans, their intelligence agencies having detected something of the Soviet preparations, decided nonetheless to proceed. They saw an opportunity to encircle Soviet forces, to claw back initiative on the Eastern Front through a pincer movement that would crush the Red Army between 2 German army groups. Hausser's Ili S Panzer Corps was positioned on the southern jaw of this strategic vise. Arrayed alongside German army units, his divisions would drive northward into the prepared Soviet defences, fighting toward a link-up point that would close the net. It was a monumental undertaking, one that would test every element of the mechanized warfare doctrine that had evolved over 3 years of brutal conflict. For Hausser, it represented both an opportunity and, though he could not have known it, a turning point. The assault began on July 5th, and immediately the Germans encountered what they should have anticipated, an enemy thoroughly prepared, dug in, reinforced, and waiting. Wave after wave of German armour rolled forward, only to be met by anti-tank guns, mines, infantry with handheld weapons, and Soviet tanks fighting defensively from prepared positions. The losses were catastrophic on both sides. Hausser's divisions fought with considerable determination and tactical skill. Individual commanders executed maneuvers of genuine ingenuity, finding gaps in the Soviet defenses, probing for weaknesses, sometimes breaking through in localized sectors. But the overall arithmetic of the battle was grim. For every Soviet tank destroyed, another appeared. For every mile gained, the cost in German vehicles and lives rose exponentially. By July 12th, the German advance had stalled. It became clear that the Soviets had sufficient reserves to contain and repel the German assault. The great encirclement that Berlin had envisioned was not going to materialize. And at that moment, at precisely that critical juncture, intelligence reached German commanders of an even larger crisis unfolding to the west. Allied forces had landed in Sicily on July 10th. Operation Husky, the invasion of southern Italy, was underway. For the first time in the war, German territory was directly threatened by invasion from the west. Everything changed. Kursk was called off. The entire German strategic calculus shifted. Forces that might have been committed to the final push in Russia were now desperately needed in the Mediterranean and potentially in Western Europe. Hausser's corps was withdrawn from the line, re-equipped and repositioned for what Hitler believed was an imminent emergency. The Eastern Front would continue, of course, but Germany's ability to sustain the kind of massive offensive operations that had characterized the war's earlier years was, in a real sense, exhausted. The Waffen-SS, and Paul Hausser with it, were entering a new and even more desperate phase of the conflict. The human cost of operations like Kursk is almost incomprehensible to us now, living as we do in a very different world. On the Soviet side, estimates of casualties from the battle, killed, wounded, missing, run into the hundreds of thousands. German losses, while smaller in absolute numbers, were equally devastating proportionally. The Waffen-SS divisions under Hausser's command lost thousands of men, irreplaceable men who had been trained and conditioned for years. These were soldiers who had internalized the ideology of the institution, who had fought with genuine commitment and often with great bravery. Their deaths were no less real, no less tragic, for having been enlisted in a cause that history has judged monstrous. And here is perhaps the deepest complexity in studying a figure like Hausser. The men under his command were not abstractions, they were individuals, many of them teenagers, many of them volunteers, who believed deeply in what they had been told they were fighting for. Hausser had cultivated among his officers and men a sense of esprit de corps, a conviction that they were engaged in something larger than ordinary military service. Whether that conviction was misplaced, whether it was built on falsehoods and corrupted ideology, all of that is true, and all of it is precisely what makes the moral reckoning so fraught. The tragedy of World War II is not simply the tragedy of ideology meeting resistance. It is the tragedy of millions of human beings, caught in systems larger than themselves, often making choices they believed to be honorable, even as those choices served purposes that were fundamentally dishonorable. Yet what made Hausser's vision truly distinctive, what separated him from so many of the party ideologues who surrounded him, was his absolute insistence that military excellence and political loyalty need not devour each other. He believed, perhaps naively in retrospect, that one could train a soldier to be both formidable in combat and genuinely committed to the National Socialist ideal, without requiring the abandonment of every professional standard that had defined the officer corps for generations. This tension, this unresolved duality at the very heart of his project, would define the Waffen-SS from its inception through to its final dissolution. By the early 1930s, Hausser had begun to articulate what might be called his military philosophy, a framework he would refine and defend for decades to come. He understood, in ways that many party figures did not, that raw ideological fervor alone could not sustain a modern military force under the stress of actual combat. A soldier firing from a trench while artillery shells fell around him did not draw strength from slogans. He drew strength from training, from trust in his officers, from the intimate bond forged through shared hardship and purposeful drill. Hausser had seen this firsthand during the First World War, had watched how those bonds either sustained men or failed them, and this knowledge remained lodged at the center of his worldview. Consider for a moment the peculiar challenge he faced. The Nazi Party desperately wanted an armed force that reflected and embodied its values, or at least its mythology about what those values were. Yet simultaneously, that force needed to function as a genuine military instrument, capable of achieving concrete objectives in the real world rather than merely in propaganda photographs. These two demands were not automatically compatible. The party wanted loyalty and ideological purity. The army needed competence and flexibility. Where these imperatives collided, how should one proceed? Most officers would have simply capitulated to whichever force held the most institutional power. Hausser instead attempted something more subtle, a kind of hybrid organism, military in structure, but ideologically infused in personnel selection and indoctrination. The men he began to recruit into what would eventually become the nucleus of the Waffen-SS came from across the Wehrmacht, though most were younger officers and NCOs who had not yet accumulated too many years of pre-Nazi military tradition. Hausser was not looking for the most ardent party members necessarily, though such individuals were certainly welcome. Rather, he sought men of initiative, physical courage, and intellectual flexibility, soldiers who could adapt to new methods while maintaining professional standards. What he offered them was something that appealed to a particular type of military mind. the chance to build something entirely new, to create a force unconstrained by the ossified hierarchies and procedures of the traditional army. To certain ambitious officers, this represented genuine opportunity. The training regimen that began to take shape under Hausser's direction reflected this dual intention. Certainly, there was political education. New recruits received instruction in Nazi ideology, in the racial theories that underpinned the regime's worldview, in the grand historical narratives that the party promoted. But this instruction existed alongside rigorous military training conducted by officers with real combat experience. Men learned formation marching and weapons handling and tactical small unit operations. They practiced until their bodies moved through these routines with the automaticity that comes only from endless repetition. They learned to respond to commands instantly, to function as a coordinated whole rather than as individuals. What appears to have motivated Hausser during this period, and here we must acknowledge some degree of necessary interpretation, since men's innermost convictions are rarely fully transparent, was not mere careerism or power-seeking, at least not primarily. He seems to have genuinely believed that he was undertaking a patriotic duty. The Weimar Republic had, in his view, and that of millions like him, failed Germany. It had left the nation weak, humiliated, economically devastated. Hitler had arrived with promises of national recovery and renewal, and while Hausser may have had reservations about certain party methods or ideological claims, he appears to have accepted the basic premise that some form of dramatic national reconstruction was necessary. Within that framework, building a capable military force seemed a reasonable and even honorable endeavor. The months turned into years, and the foundation that Hausser was laying became more substantial, more elaborate, more institutional. What had begun as a small group of enthusiasts and ideological warriors gradually transformed into something with genuine military structure and capability. Barracks were constructed or repurposed. Training schedules were established and refined. An officer corps began to form, men who understood both military professionalism and Nazi ideology, who could operate within both worlds with credibility. Supply lines were established. Equipment procurement became routine rather than improvised. The machinery of a real armed force, however small, was beginning to take recognizable shape. By the mid-1930s, the existence of this force, which was still called by various names and had not yet fully settled on the designation Waffen-SS, was becoming increasingly difficult to conceal or deny. The Anglo-German Naval Agreement of 1935 had signaled Hitler's willingness to operate somewhat more openly on the international stage, at least in matters of military expansion. The regime had begun to rearm more extensively and more publicly. The fiction that Germany was observing the restrictions of the Versailles Treaty was being abandoned. Within this context of expanding armament and increasingly open militarization, the existence of Hausser's organization became less of a secret and more of an open fact, though its exact role and relationship to the regular Wehrmacht remained contested and ambiguous. What had Hausser created, really, by this point? Not yet a full army, certainly, not even a major military organization by the standards of the day. Rather, what had emerged was something more like a proof of concept, an experimental model that demonstrated one possible path forward. It showed that men could be recruited, trained, and organized according to certain principles that blended military professionalism with ideological commitment in proportions that the Nazi leadership found increasingly appealing. Whether this blend would actually prove successful in genuine combat remained an entirely open question. Hausser had never tested his creation against a real enemy. He had no idea whether the theoretical force he had constructed would function adequately when confronted with the chaos, terror, and randomness of actual warfare. But he was about to find out. By the autumn of 1944, the military landscape that Hausser had spent 2 decades constructing had begun to fracture in ways that no amount of rigid discipline or ideological conviction could reassemble. The Eastern Front, once a theater of German expansion and conquest, had transformed into something far grimmer, a grinding, desperate struggle for survival as Soviet forces pushed westward with relentless momentum. The armies that Hausser had trained, indoctrinated, and sent into battle were now fighting not for territorial gain, but for the very existence of the Third Reich itself, and the price was measured in hundreds of thousands of casualties, many of them from the elite SS formations he had personally shaped. What remains one of the most complex and troubling aspects of Hausser's legacy during this period is his continued adaptation of Waffen-SS doctrine in response to military necessity. As conventional Wehrmacht units faltered and suffered catastrophic losses, Hausser found himself in an increasingly peculiar position. His formations were among the most feared and capable on the battlefield, yet they were also fighting a war they could no longer win. The question that haunted military strategists then, and which historians continue to grapple with now, is whether Hausser genuinely believed in 1944 that Germany could still prevail, or whether he understood at some level that defeat was inevitable and continued fighting anyway. The evidence suggests a complicated truth. Hausser's correspondence and the recollections of those who served under him indicate a man locked into a particular worldview and a particular role. He was, first and foremost, a military professional who had accepted the premises of Nazi ideology as foundational to his identity. By 1944, however, the gap between ideology and military reality had become a chasm that even the most disciplined mind could not simply ignore or rationalize away. Yet Hausser did attempt to rationalize it, or at least to compartmentalize it, in the way that many high-ranking military figures do during the twilight of a losing war. Throughout 1944, Hausser was involved in planning and executing what the Germans termed Festungskrieg, fortress warfare, or the defense of fortified positions against overwhelming odds. This was a far cry from the mobile, aggressive operations that had defined the early years of the Waffen-SS, and it represented a fundamental shift in how Hausser understood his role. He was no longer building something new, he was attempting to preserve something that was already crumbling. The men under his command, particularly the younger conscripts who were increasingly drafted into the SS as traditional Wehrmacht sources dried up, looked to him for leadership that would make sense of their sacrifice. One particularly significant moment came in August of 1944, in the aftermath of the failed plot against Hitler on July 20th. The conspiracy had been orchestrated primarily by Wehrmacht officers, men like Klaus von Stauffenberg, who had come to the conclusion that Hitler and the regime he represented had become an existential threat to Germany itself. Hausser had not been part of this conspiracy, nor was he sympathetic to it, but the purges and investigations that followed shook the military establishment profoundly. The SS, under Himmler's direction, conducted brutal interrogations and executions of suspected conspirators, and Hausser, as one of the most prominent SS generals, was inevitably drawn into the ideological aftermath of these events. The implications were profound. The July 20th plot represented, in some respects, a last moment of internal German resistance to Nazi totalitarianism, and its failure meant that any remaining hope for internal reform or transformation of the regime essentially evaporated. From this point forward, Germany's military leadership, including Hausser, was locked into a path of unconditional struggle until either victory or complete annihilation. There would be no negotiated settlement, no graceful exit, no opportunity for recalibration. Hausser, by failing to oppose the regime in any meaningful way, had committed himself to seeing the conflict through to whatever end awaited. In the autumn months following the failed conspiracy, Hausser was transferred to a new command. He took over what was designated as the 1st SS Panzer Army, which was being assembled in Hungary and was intended to spearhead a major German offensive to recapture the oil fields of Romania and stabilize the Eastern Front. This operation, codenamed Unternehmen Herbstnebel, Operation Autumn Mist, represented a last gasp of German offensive capability in the East. It was ambitious, perhaps unrealistically so, but it also represented one final opportunity for Hausser to demonstrate the martial prowess that he believed the Waffen-SS possessed. The preparations for this operation reveal much about how Hausser's thinking had evolved by this late stage of the war. He was no longer concerned primarily with recruitment or ideological purity or the grand vision of a master Germanic military caste. Instead, he was focused on tactical and operational questions: how to concentrate armor, how to coordinate with artillery, how to move men and machines across devastated terrain with supply lines stretched to the breaking point. In other words, he had been reduced from a visionary organizer to a practical military commander trying to salvage victory from the wreckage of failed strategy. Yet even in this reduced role, Hausser's reputation as a demanding and effective field commander remained intact. Officers who served under him during this period noted his tireless work ethic and his willingness to be present at the front lines, observing conditions firsthand rather than relying solely on reports from subordinates. This was, in a sense, a throwback to his earlier career as a conventional Reichswehr officer, before his alliance with the Nazi Party and before his embrace of SS ideology. The man who could command troops effectively through sheer professional competence was still there, buried beneath layers of party affiliation and ideological commitment. The irony, of course, is that professional military competence was increasingly irrelevant to the outcome of the war by 1944. No amount of skillful tactics could overcome the fundamental strategic reality that Germany was now facing superior forces on multiple fronts, with limited resources, diminishing manpower, and catastrophic losses in industrial capacity due to Allied bombing. A man with Hausser's clarity of mind could hardly have failed to see this, yet he pressed forward nonetheless, directing increasingly desperate operations with the same methodical attention to detail that he had brought to building the Waffen-SS from scratch a decade earlier. In the years that followed his death in 1982, Paul Hausser became something almost impossible to locate within the moral landscape of history. He was neither wholly forgotten nor fully reckoned with. The man who had built an institution from the ground upward, who had transformed a paramilitary police force into a military organization that would, in the end, commit some of the darkest atrocities of the 20th century. He lived long enough to see the world change around him, and yet perhaps not long enough to fully understand what his legacy had become. What is it about men like Hausser that keeps historians returning to them, searching for some hidden explanation, some moment where he might have chosen differently? Perhaps it is because his story is neither a simple tale of evil nor a redemptive arc. It exists in that difficult grey space that real history so often occupies, and we find ourselves unable to completely condemn or completely forgive. The machinery he helped construct outlived him by decades, and in some ways still casts a shadow across the way we understand military organization, institutional corruption, and the speed at which ordinary systems can accelerate toward extraordinary harm. Consider the paradox of his later years. Hausser as an old man, writing memoirs, attending reunions of former Waffen-SS officers, never once admitting to knowledge of the worst crimes of his subordinates, yet living in a world that was slowly uncovering the truth he claimed not to see. Was he genuinely ignorant? Did he truly not know? Or did he practice a kind of deliberate unknowing, a choice not to look too closely at what he might find? We may never know with certainty, and perhaps that uncertainty itself is the most honest thing history can offer about him. There is something almost melancholic about the trajectory of a man who spent his entire professional life building structures, only to watch those structures collapse, and then to spend his remaining decades in a kind of twilight, neither punished nor absolved, neither vindicated nor condemned. The Nuremberg trials processed many of the worst offenders. The Cold War divided his beloved Germany into East and West. The organizations he had served, the Reich, the SS, the Waffen-SS, ceased to exist. Yet Hausser himself remained, an elderly veteran in the Federal Republic, watched perhaps, certainly controversial, but never brought to trial for his own actions. In the end, his story teaches us something not about ideology or about the grand historical forces that swept across Europe, but rather about the quietness of institutional evil. It is rarely dramatic. It rarely announces itself. Instead, it builds slowly, one decision following another, one compromise leading to the next, until you find yourself working within a system so vast and so normalized that its original purposes have become obscured beneath layers of routine and rationalization. Hausser did not invent the Nazi state. He did not create its racial ideology. But he did something that was perhaps equally consequential. He proved that you could take those ideas and build something functioning and military within them, something that could operate at scale. The younger officers who came through his training, who learned his methods, who carried his systems into the field, they were the ones who paid the price in the end. Captured, tried, executed, imprisoned. The older architects, the men who had planned and organized and established the frameworks, many of them lived quietly into the post-war years, their names fading from public memory, even as the shadow of their work remained. What does it mean, then, to study such a figure as we drift toward sleep, toward that temporary forgetting that sleep provides? Perhaps it means recognizing that history is not made by demons or saints alone, but by ordinary men operating within systems that have lost their moral compass. It means understanding that the most dangerous institutions are not those that announce themselves openly as evil, but those that present themselves as professional, necessary, even noble, while quietly serving purposes that are anything but. The German post-war phrase, one that would emerge in the decades following, was, "We did not know." Thousands would say it. Many officers, even some commanders, would claim genuine ignorance of the final solution, of the camps, of the executions. How much of that was true, and how much was a convenient fiction? Perhaps the question itself misses the point. What matters more, in many ways, is the structure that made such claims even plausible, the compartmentalization, the layered hierarchy, the deliberate separation of knowledge that allowed men like Hausser to function for decades without bearing direct witness to the worst outcomes of the system they served. As we near the end of this long wandering through one man's life, one man's career, one man's choices and consequences, consider what remains. There remains, still, the question of institutional accountability. There remains the recognition that building something is easier than understanding what that something becomes when others take what you built and use it for purposes you may have never fully anticipated or acknowledged. There remains, too, the quieter understanding that complicity does not always require active participation. Sometimes it requires only a kind of determined focus on one's own sphere of responsibility, while remaining deliberately unaware of how that responsibility connects to larger harms. Hausser died in 1982, as we have noted, and with him passed direct knowledge of many of his decisions, many of his conversations, many of his intentions. We are left with documents, with memoirs written by an aging man recounting his own past with all the self-justification that such documents naturally contain, with testimony